Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. April 9th, 1865. At Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. For most Americans, the Civil War was over, but hundreds of miles west, in Indian Territory, the fighting had not stopped. One Confederate general was still in the field. He was not white. He was Cherokee. His name was Stand Watie, and months later, he would become the last Confederate general of the entire war to surrender. By the time he laid down his arms, Native American lands had been burned, divided, occupied, and rewritten by force. Tribes had fought on both sides. Families had turned on each other. Some had fled north as refugees. Others had ridden into battle in Confederate gray or Union blue. This was not a side story to the Civil War. It was the war, seen from the ground where it cut deepest. To understand what Native Americans actually did during the Civil War, the story cannot begin with secession or ideology. It has to begin with why Native nations were already running out of choices before the first shots were fired. Less than 20 years before the Civil War, Native Americans had already survived one national catastrophe. In the 1830s, entire tribes were forced from their ancestral homelands and marched west under federal orders. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole were driven into what became known as Indian Territory. Thousands died along the way. Families were broken. Governments collapsed. By 1861, the survivors were still rebuilding. Farms had been replanted. Councils reformed. New towns slowly took shape. The promise they had been given, this land would be theirs forever, was the only thing holding the future together. Then the United States split in two. When the Civil War broke out, Native leaders did not see a fight over abstract principles. They saw armed men moving once again across their land. They saw supply routes cutting through their territory. They saw two governments demanding loyalty from people neither had protected. Federal officials urged Native nations to stand with the Union, but Washington was not a distant memory. It was the government that had overseen removal. Treaties signed under pressure still burned in living memory. Loyalty had not prevented loss before. Southern envoys arrived quickly with their own demands. They promised protection, autonomy, and respect for tribal sovereignty. They also arrived with troops already nearby. Geography mattered. The Confederacy could punish disobedience immediately. Some Native leaders argued this was not their war at all. They urged neutrality, warning that any involvement would end badly. But neutrality required power, and Native nations no longer had the means to enforce it. As armies moved closer, councils met under pressure. The question was no longer who was right. It was who would arrive first and what they would do if resisted. Before a single major battle was fought, Native Americans were already being pulled into the Civil War, not by ideology, but by history, geography, and the narrowing space between survival and destruction. By the summer of 1861, neutrality was collapsing under pressure. Confederate troops moved north out of Texas, securing roads and river crossings that cut directly through Indian Territory. Their presence turned abstract debate into immediate danger. Refusal was no longer a position, it was an invitation to retaliation. Southern agents pressed their case in person. They promised protection of tribal land, recognition of Native governments, and freedom from federal interference. For leaders who remembered how quickly Union promises had failed in the past, these assurances carried weight, not because they were trusted, but because they came backed by men with rifles already on Native soil. The first formal alignments followed geography as much as belief. The Choctaw and Chickasaw signed treaties with the Confederacy early, committing men and supplies. For them, the calculation was blunt. Confederate forces were close, and resistance would be punished long before Union help could arrive. Survival demanded a decision, even if it felt temporary. Other nations fractured almost immediately. Among the Cherokee, rival councils claimed legitimacy, each accusing the other of endangering the nation. Some leaders argued that aligning with the South would repeat the mistake of trusting outside power. Others warned that refusing Confederate demands would bring destruction before the year was out. The split was not theoretical. It hardened into armed camps. Those divisions turned violent. Raiding parties targeted rival factions. Livestock was seized. Homes were burned as warnings. What began as political disagreement became open conflict inside Native communities, sometimes before a single Union or Confederate regiment appeared. Recruitment followed fear. Young men joined units not because they believed in secession or union, but because refusing meant being labeled an enemy. The war's first Native soldiers were not volunteers in the romantic sense. They were men navigating coercion, loyalty to kin, and the need to protect what remained. By the end of 1861, Indian Territory was no longer deciding whether to enter the Civil War. It had already entered, piecemeal, under duress, and divided against itself. The alignments that formed would soon be tested not in councils or treaties, but in battle, where promises would matter far less than gunpowder. The war reached Indian Territory before either side was fully prepared to control it. In late 1861 and early 1862, armed Native units, many newly formed and poorly supplied, were pulled into fighting that was fast, confused, and brutal. What had begun as coerced alignment now turned into real combat. Confederate-aligned Native forces were among the first to move. Cavalry units raised from the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw rode north alongside Texas regiments, attempting to secure key roads and crossings before Union troops could advance. These early operations were meant to stabilize the region. Instead, they exposed how fragile Confederate control actually was. Union commanders quickly recognized the strategic value of the territory. If Indian Territory fell fully under Confederate influence, it would open supply routes from Texas and threaten Union control of Missouri and Kansas. Federal columns moved south, bringing the war directly into Native lands that had barely recovered from removal. The first large test came in early 1862 at the Battle of Pea Ridge in northwest Arkansas. Native cavalry fought alongside Confederate forces, charging Union positions in terrain they knew well. The fighting was chaotic, and when the battle turned against the Confederacy, accusations followed, claims that some Native fighters scalped fallen Union soldiers. Whether isolated acts or exaggerated reports, the stories spread quickly. Those accusations mattered. They hardened attitudes in the North and stripped Native soldiers of any remaining ambiguity. From this point on, many Union officers no longer saw Native fighters as irregular allies, but as enemies to be crushed. The war in the West grew less restrained and more personal. Pea Ridge ended in Union victory, and with it came a turning point. Confederate momentum in the region stalled. Native units that had been promised protection and support found themselves retreating alongside white regiments that were already pulling back. The reality became impossible to ignore. Confederate control of Indian Territory was unstable and slipping. For Native communities, the consequences were immediate. Retreat meant exposure. Farms were abandoned, towns emptied, and families scattered as armies passed through. The war was no longer something happening nearby. It was moving through Native land, reshaping it with every step. After Pea Ridge, the illusion that Native participation could be managed or contained was gone. The Civil War in Indian Territory had crossed a line, from pressured alignment into open, escalating violence that would not easily be undone. The next phase would only deepen that destruction. After Pea Ridge, the fighting in Indian Territory no longer followed clean lines. Confederate retreats and Union advances created power vacuums that Native communities were forced to navigate on their own. Authority fractured. Law collapsed. The war turned inward. Among the Cherokee, the split became irreversible. Rival governments claimed legitimacy, each backed by armed supporters. Neighbors who had once shared councils now rode with opposing forces. This was not symbolic division. It was civil war inside a nation already weakened by removal. Violence spread without formal battles. Armed bands raided settlements, accused of harboring enemies. Food stores were seized, livestock driven off, and homes burned as warnings. Families fled at night, unsure whether the next armed group would arrive wearing Confederate gray, Union blue, or no uniform at all. For many Native Americans, the most dangerous enemy was no longer an outside army, but former allies. Old political disputes hardened into blood feuds. Leadership eroded as elders lost control over younger warriors, acting in self-defense or retaliation. The structures that had held communities together after removal began to give way. Union forces advanced again in mid-1862, reclaiming much of the territory the Confederacy had failed to hold. But their return did not restore order. Federal columns moved on, leaving behind instability rather than protection. Native civilians found themselves trapped between shifting fronts with no reliable authority to appeal to. Those who could fled north into Kansas, joining growing refugee camps. Disease and hunger followed them. Those who stayed behind faced reprisals from whichever faction passed through next. The attempt to survive by choosing sides had given way to a harsher reality. Survival now meant enduring chaos. By the end of 1862, Indian Territory was no longer a strategic prize. It was a devastated landscape. Native Americans were still fighting, still choosing, still adapting. But the war had already taken something irreplaceable from them: the ability to control events within their own nations. What came next would only deepen that loss. By 1863, the logic that had shaped early alignments no longer applied. The war in Indian Territory was no longer about choosing the right side. It was about staying alive in a place where authority shifted weekly and violence had become routine. Union forces attempted to stabilize the region by raising native regiments of their own. Some Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole fighters who had opposed Confederate alignment or who had fled north earlier now returned under Union banners. These units were meant to restore order and secure supply lines, but they also deepened divisions that had already turned lethal. The largest confrontation came at the Battle of Honey Springs in the summer of 1863. Union and Confederate forces clashed in what became the most decisive battle fought in Indian Territory. White soldiers, black troops from the United States colored troops, and Native Americans fought on both sides. The scale of the battle shattered any remaining illusion that this was a peripheral war. When the Confederacy was defeated at Honey Springs, its ability to contest the territory collapsed. Union control followed, but again, control did not mean safety. For Native civilians, the battle marked a transition from contested ground to occupied ground, with all the uncertainty that followed. As Confederate forces withdrew, many Native fighters were left behind. Supplies vanished, pay stopped. Promised protection never arrived. Units dissolved into smaller bands, not out of ideology, but necessity. War became personal and local, fought over food, shelter, and family survival rather than territory or principle. This was the point at which the Civil War became something else entirely for Native Americans. It was no longer a national conflict they were caught inside. It was a condition they lived with, shaping daily decisions, movements, and loyalties in ways that no treaty or proclamation could undo. By the time the broader war began turning decisively in favor of the Union, Native Americans were already fighting a different war altogether, one without clear fronts, clear allies, or any promise that victory elsewhere would bring relief at home. As the Confederacy weakened across the South, one Native leader refused to disengage. Stand Watie, a Cherokee commander who had aligned with the Confederacy from the beginning, continued fighting long after organized Southern control in Indian Territory had collapsed. His war was no longer about territory. It was about leverage, survival, and refusing to vanish. Watie's forces operated as mounted raiders, striking Union supply trains, cutting communication lines, and disappearing into terrain they knew intimately. These raids were not symbolic. They disrupted federal logistics and forced Union commanders to divert troops to protect roads and depots in a region already stretched thin. His effectiveness earned him recognition from the Confederate government. Watie was promoted to brigadier general, becoming the only Native American to hold that rank in the Confederate Army. The promotion acknowledged his success, but it could not change the strategic reality. The Confederacy was losing everywhere that mattered. Guerrilla warfare intensified the suffering of civilians. Union retaliation fell not just on fighters, but on towns suspected of sheltering them. Homes were destroyed, food supplies confiscated. The line between combatant and non-combatant collapsed entirely, leaving Native communities exposed to constant reprisal. As Confederate armies surrendered in the East during the spring of 1865, Watie remained in the field. His resistance was no longer connected to victory. It was a delay, an attempt to preserve bargaining power in a world that had already moved on. But the leverage never materialized. In June 1865, months after Lee's surrender, Stand Watie finally laid down his arms. He was the last Confederate general to do so. The moment carried symbolic weight, but it offered no protection. When the fighting stopped, Native Americans did not gain a voice in the peace that followed. They gained scrutiny. Waddy's surrender closed the military chapter of Native participation in the Civil War. What remained was the reckoning, one shaped not by how long they fought, but by who had won. And the consequences of that victory were about to be imposed with little regard for how the war had been endured. The end of fighting did not bring relief to Native nations. It brought federal officials, new treaties, and a reckoning shaped entirely by Union victory. When Confederate resistance collapsed, Native Americans were not treated as communities caught in the middle of a civil war. They were treated as defeated participants. In the months after 1865, federal commissioners summoned tribal leaders to renegotiate treaties under threat of force. Previous agreements were declared void. New terms were imposed with little room for refusal. The logic was simple. Tribes that had aligned with the Confederacy had broken their obligations and would now pay for it. One of the first demands concerned slavery. Enslaved people held by Native owners were emancipated, and tribes were required to grant them citizenship and rights within their nations. Morally, the demand reflected the outcome of the war. Politically, it destabilized governments already weakened by years of violence and division. Land followed quickly. Large portions of Indian territory were seized or sold at reduced rates to the federal government. These lands were not taken because Native Americans had lost battles. They were taken because the Union had won the war, and now had the power to redraw the map without negotiation. Some Native leaders attempted to argue that their alignment had been coerced, that neutrality had been impossible, that communities had been divided against their will. These explanations carried little weight. The post-war settlement was not interested in context. It was interested in control. Federal troops enforced the new order. Resistance was met with removal, imprisonment, or further loss of territory. What had once been presented as punishment for wartime choices quickly became a broader campaign to consolidate authority over Native land. The war had ended on paper. For Native Americans, it simply changed form. Violence gave way to legal pressure, occupation, and enforced dependency, tools that proved just as effective at reshaping their future as armies had been. At the formal end of the war, Native Americans appeared once more, this time far from Indian territory. When the surrender documents were written at Appomattox, they were drafted by Ely Parker, a Seneca officer serving on Ulysses S. Grant's staff. A Native American had put the final words to the conflict that had torn Native lands apart. The irony was quiet, and it changed nothing. What followed was not reconciliation, but consolidation. Tribes that had fought for the Confederacy were punished. Tribes that had resisted or fled were pressured. Tribes that had tried to remain neutral lost land anyway. The war did not distinguish between their choices once it was over. Measured in actions, Native Americans had done almost everything the Civil War allowed. They raised regiments. They fought in pitched battles. They charged at Pea Ridge and broke at Honey Springs. They raided supply lines, sheltered families, fled north as refugees, and endured occupation. Some resisted until the last Confederate general surrendered. Others returned in Union blue, hoping alignment might protect what remained. Measured in outcomes, none of those actions secured safety. By the early 1870s, Native nations had lost vast portions of the land they still held at the war's start. Governments were weakened, borders redrawn, and authority increasingly dictated by federal officials backed by soldiers who had learned their trade in the Civil War itself. The war did not answer Native Americans with victory or defeat. It answered them with exposure. Every path, loyalty, resistance, neutrality, led to the same narrowing future because the power to decide outcomes had already shifted beyond their reach. So when we ask what Native Americans did during the Civil War, the story resolves without a single label. They fought when fighting was forced on them. They adapted when survival demanded it. They endured a war that used their land, divided their nations, and then moved on. What they did was everything they could. What they received in return was a peace written without them.